Thanks a lot for being with us. We are being a whole day sharing a conversation on reintegration. For us, sharing your experience with us is very important from the other side of the world. So I'm going to present you to our people. If you give me a little chance to read some of your overview. Maruna is Professor of Criminology at the University of Manchester, having previously taught at Rutgers University, the University of Cambridge, and elsewhere. His book on Making Good, How Ex-Convicts Reform and Rebuild Their Lives was named the Outstanding Contribution to the Criminology by the American Society of Criminology in 2001. He also received awards from the Howard League for Penal Freedom and the Economic and Social Research for this work impact on penal policy. So we hope to share with you something like 30 minutes. And from now on, you are free. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I'm delighted to be asked to speak here. It's a real honor for me. It's about 10 years ago today, really, that I was there in Santiago as a guest and got to do a number of lectures and fell in love with the country. I also got into a couple of prisons as well. I have to say I enjoyed that probably more than I'll enjoy sitting here and talking to you from my office. But nonetheless, I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all, even if I can't see you. In a moment, I'm going to turn on the slides, so you won't see me either. But just so you know, I really am here. It's not just a recording. Let's see if I can work this out. I press this button, and I share screen, and then I press this button, and
perfect.
Wonderful. Okay. So if you've spent the day talking about reintegration, then this should be an appropriate enough way to cap things off here. I'm gotten very interested in a British concept, and
Professor,
I think it's
excuse me?
Yes.
Can you swap your presentation, please? Because it seems like we are seeing the other screen.
Oh, no. Okay.
We can see your following slide as well.
Oh, okay. That shouldn't be happening. Okay, I'll see what I've done here.
Is that little screen just on the bottom of the screen?
So I
F5. And there is a screen just...
Oh, to the side here.
That's much better. Okay.
All right, great, yeah. I don't know if there's any other way to get rid of that.
That one.
Okay, great. So where was I? I was talking about rehabilitation cultures. This is a uniquely British concept, I think. I'm not sure if it has traveled to Chile or indeed elsewhere, but it's an important one, and I've been very excited about it. The idea behind rehabilitation culture is a kind of simple one. It says that for the longest time, especially in British prisons, we've thought about rehabilitation as synonymous with programs, and we got very excited about programs in the 1990s and the early 2000s, and invested a good bit of money in these on the grounds that the What Works evidence suggested that with these programs, we could see a big reduction in our recidivism rates, which didn't come to fruition, unfortunately. And it's easy to see why when a program oftentimes is a matter of 1 or 2 hours a day, maybe sometimes even a week, and the rest of a person's time is spent outside of a program. So even if they're getting fantastic messages, very positive role modeling and so forth within these programs, they're returning to prison wings on ordinary landings where they may have those messages completely undermined. And of course, in the current state of British prisons, whether you're familiar or not, we're undergoing quite a crisis at the moment in terms of suicide rates, violence, staff shortages, overcrowding of prisoners. So we have historically bad relationships on our prison wings and landings. And at the same time, this commitment to rehabilitation in these programs. So the idea of the rehabilitation culture is that we should try to build rehabilitation in to the ordinary, to the day-to-day, to the wider life of a prison, rather than having it limited in any way to just what's going on in our programs, trying to get ordinary prison staff and prisoners who aren't in specialist programs interested and involved in the work of rehabilitation. And I think that's an important idea. I think it's led to some really fantastic conversations with the prison service. So I'm all in terms of this concept of rehabilitation culture. As an academic, however, we have to question everything about various ideas. And with rehabilitation culture, I have two primary questions, and they're both fairly fundamental. The first is, what is rehabilitation? And the second is, what is culture? And these kind of big questions precede the underlying, the bigger question of whether we can create a rehabilitation culture inside our prisons. We first have to know what the two words even mean. And the two are highly contested words. I know in Spanish you don't have the word rehabilitation. I think the word we used when I was there in Chile was reinsertion or reinserción. I of course can't pronounce it correctly, but rehabilitation as a concept in English has undergone quite a rocky road over the last, say, 4 decades. This is a now very dated book called The Decline of the Rehabilitative Ideal. In the 1970s and 1980s, the rehabilitation became almost a dirty word. The idea, as Richard Korn, the outstanding academic, said back in 1992, not even, and no one but an academic simpleton would even use the word rehabilitation without apprehension or sarcasm or the like. And we've all seen Shawshank Redemption and elsewhere where we see the facade of what it goes under the name of rehabilitation. Even our charities, you mentioned the Howard League of Penal Reform in your introduction. The Howard League is itself a reform organization. They are all about rehabilitation. Even the Howard League worried about the use of this word in the rehabilitation culture report that came out. They saw this as at best optimistic and at worst patronizing, and suggested that isn't it time we faced up to the reality that prison can very rarely be a rehabilitative experience, and this has been a common kind of reaction to the notion of a rehabilitative prison. I think one of the problems here is that rehabilitation has two different meanings in English, and both are important, but they can often be contradictory in some ways. So if you look up the Webster's dictionary, one of the main dictionaries in the English language, there's two definitions for rehabilitation. One is to make fit or capable as for functioning in society. And this is the way we often think about rehabilitation, that we are changing somebody, we are making them able to function, returning them to normality, so to speak. But the other definition is to clothe or to qualify oneself. And we see that definition as well. So when we use the term Rehabilitation of Offenders Act in the UK, an act that was born in the 1970s, that was the way we were using the term. The Rehabilitation of Offenders Act isn't about giving offenders treatment or changing the bad into the good. Rather, it's about letting people move on from their offenses, letting them seal their former criminal records, and thinking of rehabilitation as restoring their rights as full citizens. So that tension is always there between the two words, and I think it's important that if we're going to talk about a rehabilitation culture, that we're doing both of those two things. We're both helping people change their lives, but we're also trying to help them change the stigmas that they face, help them redeem their reputations and their character in the sense of the perceptions that others have of them. And I should also say, there's plenty of other problematic terms. So when I think about rehabilitation culture, and I think, well, perhaps we should use other terms. The choice for me often is this notion of desistance, but desistance is a terrible term in English as well as Spanish, I'm sure, and other concepts, redemption, treatment, even things like reintegration or reinsertion, all have problems as well when it comes to meaning what we want it to mean in this case. And there's an irony about this, that basically we don't have a good word for creating the kind of cultures of hope that we would like to create in criminal justice. And that lack of language is ironic, considering that language is so fundamental to what we mean when we talk about cultures. So that brings me to the next aspect and an important one. When we talk about a rehabilitation culture, well, what do we mean by a culture? Culture comes from the Latin for tending the soil or cultivation. We think of lab cultures and the like in English, where a culture in botany. And that's an interesting way of thinking about prisons, as we're tending to the soil in some ways. Culture then went on to become synonymous with high culture, so refinement of taste and manners. This sort of the upper class had culture and the rest of us lacked it. But anthropologists have long since changed the meaning of the term to refer to basically everything about society. So our beliefs, our arts, our laws, our customs, habits, and so forth are all part of what we think of when we think of a society's culture. And Clifford Geertz is the anthropologist of choice often, describes culture as webs of meaning, the ways we interpret and understand the world around us is fundamental to this notion of culture. More recently, social scientists have started thinking about organizational culture. So not just societies, not just villages or tribes, but companies, businesses all have their own internal cultures. These organizations can be studied in the same way that an anthropologist would study a village or a clan. And these organizations, like cultures, other sort of societies, are held together by these webs of meaning, these shared assumptions that Geertz talks about. And there has been research on the culture of prisons, and in particular staff culture. So Elaine Crawley has done some of the most important research in this regard, along with Richard Sparks and others. And she talks about some of the characteristics of prison officer culture include an expectation of solidarity between other prison officers, a sense of suspicion at all times, suspicion of certainly prisoners, but also visitors, also upper management of the prisons, feelings of social isolation, a sense in which they have a special knowledge that they're unable to share with even friends and family on the outside. They feel very much like they belong to a special world, a shameful or at least isolated place. And then lastly, a strong emphasis on physical courage. The key aspects of the job involve bravery and the ability to put up a fight if needed in an emergency. Kennedy and Deal talk about these organizational cultures as being understandable in a variety of ways. The two key things that jump out at me when they're talking about organizational culture, however, are the concepts of stories and rituals. And so to me, the question of how do we create a rehabilitative culture can be made simpler if we, instead of looking at these broad concepts that can be so controversial, to break that down into saying, well, how do we create rehabilitative stories, and how do we create rehabilitative rituals? And so with the remainder of my time, I'll try to focus on those two aspects, of which I've done a good bit of research. The first is the stories that we tell in our organizations. Along with colleagues Michelle Butler and others, I've done a study recently of the staff culture in Northern Irish prisons in Northern Ireland, where they've been having a number of reforms recently, and they're trying to hire a new generation of prison staff to do their best to overcome some of the entrenched negativity among who are sometimes referred to as dinosaurs, the older prison staff. And then this may be something that you can relate to. You have similar dynamics in many countries. So they brought Michelle and I in to try to look at issues of racism, issues of sectarianism among their prison staff, and indeed the stories that we collected from prison officers as well as prisoners were very negative for the most part. There were certainly many of the characteristics that Crawley talked about: suspicion, feelings of isolation. There was much talk of fighting and times that staff had been threatened. In particular, during the war we experienced in Northern Ireland, and the frontline difficulties that were experienced in the prisons during that time, and there was a complete lack, really, of the sort of stories that we might think of as being rehabilitation stories. So we heard things like, look, we have the worst people in Northern Ireland in here. There's nobody in here for skipping school. We've got some bad people in here. And for the bad guys, I don't think it will make one iota of difference what you do with them, treatment or so forth. They are bad, and that is it. This is an extreme example, but it was representative of the kind of real pessimism that we heard throughout most of our staff interviews. Another quote here about the dangers that staff face at any given time. So what would rehabilitative stories look like? What would they sound like, more to the point? I often ask prisons who tell me they are doing rehabilitation culture and that they have a rehabilitative climate. I ask them to tell me who their great success stories are. Can you, as management, or can your staff rattle off examples of prisoners who have come through this process and have turned their lives around? Can other prisoners, more importantly, tell the same stories? And it sometimes surprises them, sometimes bothers them. This question, for confidentiality reasons, we could never talk about prisoners. Well, they talk about prisoners all the time. The prisoner who killed somebody, the prisoner who took another officer hostage, or so forth. So there's no issues around anonymity, and if they wanted to, they could change somebody's name in telling these stories. But the fact is, we don't have those kind of stories floating around our prisons. We don't have a wall of fame on each hallway showing all the former prisoners who are now doing outstanding things. In fact, the former prisoners who they know of and who get talked about in stories are those former prisoners who come back to the prison time and time again, because in prison you only see the failures, you don't see those successes. So and likewise, policymakers, members of the public, the successes are always invisible, and who we see in the media are the failures. And this is one of the reasons why I've done the work I have done over the last 20 years, and in books like Making Good, and I won't talk too much about that work except to say that its impetus 20 years ago was precisely this lack of stories in the general public of success, of people who go to prison. You know, we in criminology are in a very negative field where we are, just like prisons, only dealing with the worst of the worst. We're only dealing with failings in society. And it's often hard, even for us in criminology, to see these successes, to see these positives. And so we tried with that research and others to get those success stories to a wider audience of practitioners, students, and members of the wider public. And in that regard, the best storytellers we have available to us are sometimes referred to as, in English, credible messengers, or wounded healers. That is, these are individuals who have been there, who have walked the walk, and have themselves gone through a prison experience. Bringing back such individuals into prisons as so-called wounded healers or professional X's can be one of the best ways of ensuring that these stories of success are delivered in a credible way to both prisoners and prison staff. I've been inside a prison recently for a graduation of a program we run for university students and prisoner students at a prison called Risley near Manchester. And in that program, for our graduation, we brought in a speaker who himself had been through Risley Prison and is now running an organization for reentering ex-prisoners. And the reaction from the prisoners was outstanding. But the one that'll always stick with me was the staff members who remembered this guy from 10 years earlier, and they were shocked to see him standing up there, shocked to see how he had turned his life around. They had no idea, as they wouldn't, there would be no reason for them to know and to have followed up his story. These are powerful testimonies for both staff and prisoners. Prisoners often say they want a guide who is like them, who has walked where they've walked, and they can learn from that person's experiences. One of my favorite quotes in this regard was one prisoner who told me Re-entry, reinsertion is like a minefield, and there's only one way to get through a minefield, and that's to follow the person in front of you. So we need to see those role models, like in any walk of life. You know, one doesn't become a dentist without mirroring and shadowing other dentists. You don't become an offender without learning from other offenders, and so forth. And these beliefs are crucial in the work we do. One of the other studies I've done, this isn't from the Making Good research, but a study I did of public attitudes around criminal justice. We created this scale on what we called a belief in redeemability. And basically, these items were asking people whether they believe that people who we call offenders can change, or rather, do you think they're stuck and have little hope of ever changing for the better? And the public's answers to this question are extremely powerful. Their answers to these three items that make a scale are one of the best predictors of their views about the death penalty, their views about longer prison sentences, their views about investing in various forms of rehabilitation and so forth. Whether we believe that people can change is crucial. And so we wanted to do in that research is to find out what was driving these beliefs in redeemability. And to get at that, we interviewed some of those people in our research who were the least punitive. That is, they had the strongest belief in redeemability. And we asked them where they got these views. This is just one of the interviewees that we talked to, and she had a fantastic explanation. A 41-year-old female living in London. She was very strongly in favor of redeemability, and we asked her why, and she gave us this great story. She said, well, you do see kids that are rude, hanging around street corners, you know, breaking into cars and showing no respect. That whole thing in general is there. But I think to an extent that has always been the case. I think it's just a bit of peer pressure, I'm assuming. I think actually they do grow out of it. I think of my brothers as teenagers. They were just hideous, vile kids. They grew out of it. I had a nasty cousin too, a horrible, horrible little boy, lovely now. So in the last 5 years, he's suddenly got a job and he's fantastic. I really thought he was an absolute no-hoper. And what this quote demonstrates is that power of stories, of having the cases in mind, a human face for these young people who are out on the streets. She doesn't see the young people as other, as a kind of alien species, but rather sees them in a life course framework, understands that they're going through a phase that they're going to grow out of, hopefully, ideally, with a little bit of help. And that kind of role taking, that her ability to understand this offending from the point of view of others really comes from knowing those stories. Her brothers, her cousins, and so forth are what's given her that ability to empathize in that way with young people who are clearly very different than her and her lifestyle as an adult person. So one of the things that we've seen positive in this regard is when you get public involved with different criminal justice interventions, they're able to put more of a human face on this creature that we call the offender that we so worry about. And by doing that, they're able to humanize those people, and therefore their views change in important ways. Just one quick example. I know I'm running out of time, but an extreme example of this is the way we treat sex offenders in the West, probably similarly internationally. Sex offenders are, of course, treated as the lowest of the low in our prisons and in our criminal justice system in general. They are referred to with names like animals or monsters, predators, and the like. And as a result, they're treated by the system as if they are irredeemable, as if there's not a chance that they could change. And as part of that, we have created a criminal justice system and justice programs like the notification laws in the United States that are themselves irredeemable and put the individuals even further away from any chance of reintegrating into society more generally. And yet, the research finds that those groups that have the most contact with such individuals, and these would be largely treatment professionals, are the least likely to stigmatize and to demonize these individuals in this way, which is very consistent with the research presented a moment ago about stereotyping and outgroups, that by having this kind of familiarity with the individuals, by humanizing and putting a human face on the so-called sex offender, staff are able to see them as fellow human beings and are less likely to treat them in these kind of stigmatizing ways that would only re-encourage more offending. So when I think about the second part of this equation, what are our rituals in prisons? Well, our rituals in prison are famous. They're certainly famous in the 1950s and 60s. People like Irving Goffman, Harold Garfinkel wrote a lot about what they called degradation ceremonies or the mortification process of the prison, the kind of ritual humiliations of having your head shaved, of the name, losing your name, being referred to as a number, the kind of the lining up, the head counts, the night checks, the cell searches, all of these rituals that we know make up the day-to-day of our prison life are each, whether by design or default, humiliations for the person in prison, and they result in creating the prisoner. They take a normal human being or a human being who's been convicted of a crime, and they turn them into a prisoner through these ritualistic processes. And the problem is, once, and again from the 1960s social anthropology researchers, once we've created these prisoners through our degradation ceremonies, there is no other dramatic rituals or ceremonies to return them back to society. When we return them to society, we do so without hardly a word of public notice. And from a ritual point of view, therefore, nothing has happened to cancel out the stigmas imposed upon them by the earlier commitment ceremonies, creating a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. So in other words, and that's probably too big a concept to throw in at the very end here, but in other words, we're very good at rituals of stigma and rituals of humiliation in criminal justice. We don't have the rituals at the end of the process that would return the person. So we don't have what are sometimes called reintegration rituals. We do reintegration on the quiet. We do it very subtly. So we don't have these kind of public announcements certifying that a person has changed in the way that we publicly recognize and certify their initial deviance. We have in the desistance literature identified some outstanding reintegration ceremonies or rehabilitation rituals, like the court, the rehabilitation court rooms in France, whereby an individual goes through a trial process, much like the criminal trial, but rather than trying to decide whether they're guilty or innocent, the person is going through a process, calling witnesses, taking testimony, to determine whether they have or haven't fully rehabilitated themselves. And just like in the courtroom in a degradation ceremony, at the end, the judge pounds a gavel and declares through that legal magic that only judges in the judicial system carry, the person has been officially and legally rehabilitated. And like we talked about earlier with the rehabilitation concept, they also return to full citizenship. They are given their full rights back and are able to move on with their lives in a way that wouldn't have been possible without the status change of the rituals. So the question is, can we bring rituals like that into our prisons? And this is, far too glib a slide to end on, but these are clips from what I would consider reintegration rituals inside of prisons. I mentioned these earlier already. These are from graduation ceremonies for prisoner students. The first one, the top picture is from a British graduation, the bottom from an American. But in both of these situations, these are destigmatizing rituals, so to speak, inside of our own prisons, where prisoners are taking university level courses and are distinguishing themselves to the point of recognition even within the prison itself. This is the top picture is a prison officer applauding these prisoner students as they graduate from the course. So these, to me, suggest the slightest hints of getting there. That we have the ability, we know what rehabilitation stories look like, and we know what rehabilitation rituals look like, and it's a matter of trying to put these into our day-to-day work in the prisons and countering those rather more stigmatizing stories and rituals that tend to characterize the day-to-day. So that's all I've got. Let's see if you're still there.
Yes, here we are.
Oh, you're there. Great. And I don't know if we're gonna.
We are something like 1,000 just hearing you.
I don't know if we're gonna try to take any questions or anything.
Yeah, we do. Wait a second, please.
Okay.
Professor, sorry for my English.
No. Sorry for my Spanish.
Sorry. Our main subject of this event is also about prison and judicial system, but also in the community work. So these kind of rituals and stories, how do you see them in terms of reintegration to society? We also kind of hear a lot of ceremonies and rituals and stories about exclusion and a lot of bad stories about the experience of people re-entering their communities, their families. So have you heard any experience in that area or that kind of work?
Yeah. That's a great question. Yeah, I think it's absolutely crucial. I've often argued that if the public isn't involved in these rituals, then they're really not reintegration or reinsertion rituals. To be true to the concept of rehabilitation or reintegration, it has to be that through the gate, you have to have families involved. You have to have the public involved, communities involved, because they're the ones who are really doing the rehabilitation work. And too often I hear stories just like the ones you're mentioning, that you have a person who maybe goes through a change process in a prison. He does involve himself in programs and he comes out wanting to change. And he comes back to a family, to a community where people aren't ready to let him change. They expect him to be the person he was before he went in and so forth, and you get the person winding up coming back into prison and so forth. So I definitely think our prison work needs to draw on families, communities much more strongly than we do. In Northern Ireland, where we did this research, all the prisons are located very far from the prisoners' communities, just like they are in the United States or in England. And so the people who are coming into the prison, and there are volunteers and excellent staff inside the prison, but they're not coming from the same communities where the person actually lives and is from themselves. Those communities, disadvantaged communities, broken communities, so to speak, are not getting jobs inside the prison service. And so you don't have that kind of glide path from getting in. So what's happening inside the prison is very isolated from what's happening on the outside. And that just doesn't make any sense. You know, I understand why, for financial reasons, these prisons are out in rural communities far away from the city, but from a reintegration standpoint, it doesn't make sense. So you're absolutely right. You have to bring the person to the community in doing these kind of work, or it's not rehabilitation.
Another question? Give me a second, please, Professor Maruna.
Hello, my name is Patricio. I work at reintegration program here in Chile. I have a pair of questions regarding what you were talking about. The first one is, well, here in Chile we have, when someone commits a felony or some kind of offense, after they fulfill their prison time, they have criminal records. So I was thinking of how all these rituals that you were talking about, which I believe are very significant for the lives of these people, I don't know what are the material effect of that, because even when you have a ritual of acknowledging that they are rehabilitated, I was wondering the difficulties these people have to endure when they go out to the outside world and the criminal records works against them to, for example, apply for a job or some kind of opportunity, of real opportunity. So how do you see, for example, the relationship between those kind of rituals and the commitment, for example, of changing maybe some ways the criminal records way in which are applied? I don't know if I'm making myself clear, but so, and my second question is, you were also talking about how it is important to create a rehabilitation culture within prisons. So my question is, how do you think that creating this rehabilitation culture can also take part in the private and public sector? Because I was also thinking that people, when they go out of prisons, they try to look out for opportunities, and usually these are in the public or the private sector. So in my experience, at least, a lot of these people who work in these sectors tend to be or have discrimination towards these people. So how do you think that the creation of rehabilitation cultures have to not just to be developed in prisons, but also like in other kind of contexts? So thank you very much.
I know, bro. Yeah, great questions. The first one around the criminal record, I'm really glad you raised that. They're both related, but I wasn't able to get it through well enough in my talk with the limited time. But that's where I was going with this, the two definitions of rehabilitation that I mentioned. One of them is changing the person's attitudes and beliefs and changing their character. The other definition is changing the stigma that they face, the reclothing them. So the Rehabilitation of Offenders Act is a sealing of a person's criminal records and allowing them to move on from their criminal offense. And I think the two have to go hand in hand. You know, there's no good in changing somebody's cognitive errors and their thinking if they're everywhere they go, they're going to be stigmatized against and not allowed to move on from their offense. Diva Pager has a great book out called The Criminal Credential, and she writes about criminal records in exactly the way you were talking about, as kind of the last way that society is legally allowed to discriminate against other people. You know, we're not allowed to discriminate on the basis of age and race and sex and all those other demographics. But not only are we allowed to discriminate against former prisoners, but by law, the law itself requires us to prohibit people with a criminal record from various jobs, various licenses, even universities and education and so forth. So it's a very difficult road to rehabilitation if we don't remove some of those legal barriers. And your question of how does this interact with the rituals I mentioned? Well, most good rituals have at the end of it a certificate, a certification. So if you think of, you know, you go through a marriage ritual, that's the fun part. But at the end of it, you get a marriage certificate. If you go through a funeral, you get a death certificate. That one's not so fun. But if you go through a graduation ritual, you're going to get a diploma at the end of it. And what those pieces of paper, that I'm not holding a real piece of paper, here's a piece of paper, what those pieces of paper mean is precisely what you're talking about. It's like Jean Valjean and Les Miserables. You know, with this yellow piece of paper, I am forever the prisoner. So we need similar certifications of rehabilitation, and we have that in some states. There is, as I mentioned, in France and elsewhere, there are a system of pardons and abilities to seal one's criminal records in various ways. And the rituals I was talking about, even though they don't seal a person's criminal record, you get a diploma of your educational achievements. And that diploma is a kind of counter stigma. It says, yes, on this hand, I've got a criminal record, but I've also got a high school degree, or I've got a university degree. And the two certifications are hopefully, if not cancel each other out, at least this one can go some way to reducing the power of this stigma. I'll have to think more, and I know I'm taking too much time already about the public and private, comparisons. But you're absolutely right. The private sector is part of that community that we need inside of prisons. We have to get employers on board. We have to have, and the research community is doing this much better than we have in the past, engaging with what are employers looking for? What is it about the criminal record that employers are unable to get past? And what do they need to hear in terms of some sense of signaling of rehabilitation from prisoners? Is it just that they've engaged in programs? Is it that they've done education while they're inside? You know, do they need a certificate saying this person is a good prisoner? They have behaved well. This is a good bet, a low risk prisoner from you. You know, what do employers look for when they think about hiring people with criminal records?
Professor Maruna, I have another question.
Okay.
We are
And then I
the
should probably go after this one. Yeah.
okay. We are the Center for Citizen Security Studies of the University of Chile.
Okay.
Are trying to not just to hear, but to mix all that experience and activities, and especially even cultures, into what we could be regarded as a public policy. Instead of, I'm talking on a proper programs with components, with objectives in different level of hierarchies. So, and even to think on something like a logical framework for an initiative that will be shared with our authorities to create a proper program. So, I mean, hearing you talking on the experience of those activities to improve the culture and rehabilitation, the question for us is how to transform them, that kind of experiences in a proper program for to give some advice to our authorities in terms of building that kind of interventions.
Yeah. No, that's a great question. It's a big question, of course, but it is, it's one of the things I was sort of implying at the beginning, that the great thing about a rehabilitation culture is that it accepts that culture is broad and wide and bigger than what we usually think of as packaged programs with workbooks and so forth. On the other hand, the problem with rehabilitation culture is it may be too broad, too abstract. As you say, how do you sell a minister on this? I mean, is it just an empty platitude that, well, anybody can say we're going to change the culture of our organization, but where's the concrete? How do you actually go about measuring whether you have changed the culture? How do you actually roll out something like a rehabilitative culture initiative? And in this regard, there's been some activities. It's a matter of finding a balance halfway between. You don't want to go too far to the end to say, we're going to make this managerialism and say, well, here are the three indicators that you need to do to show that you've got a rehabilitative culture, because that managerialist culture is precisely the type of thing we're trying to avoid with this. On the other hand, you don't want it to be so abstract to be meaningless and to be an empty concept. So I've tried to emphasize the stories and the rituals, and to say that we can actually tap into these in terms of measuring, and by measure I don't mean bean counting, but rather efforts to change you should be able to see a qualitative and a quantitative even difference in the kind of stories that staff tell, that prisoner tell in an institution, as well as in the day-to-day things that go on a ritual front. And the two of those should be related, because the stories we tell are often about rituals. So if you had memorable opportunities where you have a concert where prisoners are performing music to other prisoners, that's going to be remembered. And when you ask prisoners, tell me what's good about this institution, they'll remember something like that, or they'll remember a graduation program where the governor said good things about various prisoners, or they brought in, as we did, brought in an ex-prisoner to give a talk to the other prisoners. Those kind of rituals are the heart of the kind of rehabilitation stories that we'd like to hear more prisoners talking about, and prison staff talking about as well. So I'd have to think deeper to get you a better answer than that, but that's where I'm gonna go with.
No, that's a very good answer. Don't worry, Professor.
Okay.
Okay, that's all. Professor, thanks a lot from the University of Chile. Maybe next time you are going to be in Santiago, are going to be with our invitation.
Wonderful. Yes, I will hold you to that, and I very much look forward to staying in touch. But thanks again for having me, and all the best with your work.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
All right.
Gracias. Agradecemos a las personas que se quedaron. Recordamos que mañana tenemos el segundo día del seminario. Agradecemos a todos los panelistas en general, al profesor Maruna también. Y damos por cerrado entonces este primer día del Seminario Internacional, Bases y Experiencias para el Trabajo Local en Reinserción Social. Buenas tardes a todas y todos.